India together try to get closer, if they do, I would say is amongst the top three, if not the single most important thing in the world, because of course China and India have had immense strategic security and diplomatic rivalry for so long. But if however difficult it would be, if they are now choosing to put those things aside and try to cooperate deeply on international trade and investment matters, as well as things like climate change and many others, it would be transformational, certainly for the whole of Asia, and because of the importance of them both, transformational for the world. And that is something which I am watching, and I suggest other people do really closely, because it would attach so much more importance to the BRICS political grouping if China and India had a more cooperative basis. But if they didn't, then the BRICS group will effectively be largely symbolic. And yes, they will all make lots of noises about various topics, but it will be a little bit empty unless there's more substance, especially between the biggest members.
Point taken. But Jim, other than diplomacy, what key reforms do you think India must undertake to truly leverage its demographic advantage over, say, the next decade?
Yes, it's very, very good question and interesting issue. You know, I read some interesting longer-term reflections on what the Indian leadership wants to do by the time of the 100th year anniversary of India's full independence, and effectively to become a middle-income country. And if you translate into the kind of economic growth that's needed, that requires India to grow by 8% the next 2 decades. And its demographics are so powerful still. In theory, that should be relatively easy for India. And of course, that is what China did for 30 years until about 5 years ago. And in order to unleash that, India has to be more successful on about 3 or 4 areas, I would say. One is somehow allowing or encouraging India's labor force participation to be more structured, and therefore to be a bigger and more sustained player in aspects of the modern, sophisticated manufacturing chain that links the world. Secondly, and as part of that, India has to still make a lot of progress on the challenges of having a vastly improved productivity sector in agriculture, which of course is such a dominant part of Indian society still. And then thirdly, linked again to both, it has to somehow manage to improve the basic primary and secondary education for so many Indian people that get left behind and don't really benefit from what has been so far in a challenged world environment, a glorious decade so far for India. But a lot of Indian people haven't benefited from it. And then the very last thing is as with China and other big emerging nations, India has to be more proactive on the fight against infectious diseases, including something I've become very involved in the past decade or longer, antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance. But India could do all of these things. It just needs continued determination and strong leadership and open-minded thinking from the leaders and the advisors of India today.
Jim, if you look at global economy as a whole or global country, many countries, they're now focusing more on domestic rather than being, a trade-oriented free market economy. Do you think, given these factors, what role does tariff, play for countries like India, and how India will be able to meet the targets that we have set out for the 100th anniversary?
So I think about this in a sort of a bit more open-minded or non-static way, let's call it. Very interesting coincidence as we turn this year. The United States under Donald Trump, quite amusingly in a way, has just inherited the rotating year of chairing the G20. And I participated on a call with the Chicago School for International Affairs last week, where I've become a visiting fellow. And I suggested that a way to try to encourage Trump and his advisors to get away from this obsession of tariffs is to resurrect something that a previous US Treasury Secretary under Obama tried and became very close to achieving in the early part of the last decade in 2011-12. And that was to introduce some kind of monitoring zone for the balance of payments current accounts for really important big systematic countries like the US, like China, like Europe, and so on. And present this to Trump as a way of being more constructive way to actually helping international trade imbalances than this very, very blunt and narrow focus on tariffs, which, to be honest, the latest data make it pretty clear that they're not working. We're having this discussion on the day the latest Chinese trade figures have been produced, and yes, Chinese exports to the US have gone down, but Chinese exports to so many other places, in particular Southeast Asia and so-called the global South, are booming. And many of those countries' exports to the United States are also rising sharply. So in essence, we're having a lot of trade that's just being diverted to different places. And the way to really deal with big trade imbalances is to have more balanced rates of domestic demand growth in countries that really matter for the world. And hopefully, some more imaginative thinking can be undertaken and guide Trump away from this. And the key thing being is, of course, is already being evident. Trump is already backing off some of these tariffs because he's starting to see in his opinion poll ratings that it's hurting his core support because of the price increases. So I kind of think about it a bit differently than many other people. One other thing I should obviously point out, India, of course, is such a resilient economy, and ironically, even though it has to do better on trade, because it's so domestically demand-driven, it isn't quite as vulnerable as a lot of other, especially smaller, very open economies to this kind of Trump-led world of tariffs matter and the US becoming more domestically orientated. But I don't really believe it's very sustainable.
You know, that, Jim, brings me to what you think about the dollar, because whatever said and done, the volatility that we've seen so far this year, the dollar still remains exceptionally strong, despite the US fiscal concerns that we just kind of talked about. Do you see any realistic scenario where dollar dominance would genuinely weaken, say in the next coming 5 years, or even the next year for that matter?
I mean, I think, you know, having been involved in foreign exchange markets for over 40 years, you know, this topic comes and goes every decade, or actually is always there under the surface. And every time the dollar declines, it becomes more popular. And I think that's what we've really had in the last 12 months. The main reason why the dollar's declined this year has been because of the weaker than expected economy, and because the mood about US interest rates changed dramatically, and the Fed started and is now expected to cut interest rates further. But as so often in the past, that immediately gets confused with all these very, very credible ideas that you can't be the world's #1 currency if your economy isn't always becoming even more powerful over the long term. And I think we're going to live with that dilemma and unknown issue for so long until some magical moment where we all suddenly realize, with the benefit of hindsight, that the dollar isn't the #1 currency anymore. And I think there are three things that will lead us to some point in the future where that is the reality. The first one I've touched on is the growth of both China and India. And you know, if we get to the stage, and it's probably not for another decade, where China is the same size as the US, despite all their problems, then it's very hard to see how the dollar can be so dominant in trade, especially with countries that China does more and more of this trade with. And of course, It's the same with India, although a little bit slower. The second thing I would say, which is a sort of newer thought for me that I've been thinking a lot about recently, with the rise of so-called stablecoins, currently the US authorities, especially the Treasury Secretary, seem to think that that's going to preserve even stronger dollar dominance forever. But what they seem to be missing, from what I can tell, is other countries are quite likely, and you can see evidence of it in Beijing and elsewhere, are starting to develop their own concepts of stable coins. And this could become a much more powerful tool of organizing international trade between countries that are the dominant trade part, in this case China, and anybody else that they're choosing to. And in this sense, it goes back a bit to the BRICS group. I don't think it's possible that we're going to get one single currency out of the BRICS group anytime in the next 5 years, or for that matter, probably 50 years. But I do think it's quite feasible that more and more of some kind of trade mechanism involving currency other than the dollar between them is pretty likely to happen. And what it will mean is a different, third thing is a sort of a bit of a different kind of monetary system, because in my era, and most people now, we're all trained to think you can't be a major currency unless you allow your currency to be the dominant one for global capital flows. And maybe that won't end up being quite the case as we all think, but we'll see. This is another one of the amazing number of really interesting intellectual issues that are out there.
All right.